Hey folks, Eddie from Totally Wired Guitars here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Fender American Original 60s Jaguar. Now, I know what you're thinking. This looks almost exactly like the AV65 Jag, and yeah, there have only been a few minor changes. The first thing is that they have changed from vintage frets to vintage tall frets. A lot of folks on the forums and stuff were griping about this. Honestly, I've heard that earlier in the run, this series was released back in 2018, that they felt a lot taller back then. This is part of the last run from 2022 before the series was discontinued. And if someone was asking me to play this blindfolded, they feel almost exactly like vintage frets to me. A few other things that have changed. It is 9.5 inch radius, so a more modern radius than the 7 1/4 radius that have come on the AV series before this one. Instead of the AV65 or pure vintage 65 Jaguar pickups, they have gone back to using the Alnico 2 AV62 or American Vintage 62 pickups. It's a curious choice, but it is in line since this isn't technically a vintage reissue. And if I were to guess, Fender, being Fender, is probably just using leftover stock that they had from the American Vintage 62 series. The last big change to this as compared to the AV65 is how the nitro finish is done. The nitro finish that came on the AV65 series was known as a nitro flash coat. It basically meant that all of the various layers, from the sealer to the color layer to the clear coat, was all nitro. The AV65 series had a finish that was decidedly thinner than the nitro finish on the AV62s that came before them. The AV62s had a really thick undercoat that was made of poly, whereas the AV65s had a much thinner and also a much more brittle finish, which some folks loved, especially because it was way easier to distress those finishes or naturally relic them. Whereas the finish on this one is more of a return to the same finish that they did on the American Vintage 62 line, which comprised of a poly undercoat, definitely thinner than those found on the AV62s, and then your nitro color layer, and then your nitro clear coat. I'd say that this finish, as compared to the AV65, is definitely a bit more sturdy, if you will. It's got a little more of a plasticky feel and doesn't have that kind of like powdered kind of coating that you would feel on the AV65s when those came out new, or even, on offsets that you might get from the Fender custom shop, who still use that flash coating process. But that said, I think that the finish on this feels fantastic, and compared to the AV65s, which I've long hailed to potentially be the best reissue Jaguar ever produced, the necks on these ones that I have serviced, and this one that I'm holding in my hand now, is just a little bit stickier feeling than the AV65. And that obviously will go away the more you play it, or you can, take like a Brillo pad and just like lightly scuff the back of this neck and then polish it up again with some compound to bring that shine back. But yeah, that's a little bit annoying. I've also found that to be the case with some of the Johnny Marr Jaguars that have come out in recent years. It's definitely not as thick or heavy as some of the American Vintage 62 Jags that I have worked on and played and owned over the years. Some of those have definitely been like 9 pounds and over, whereas most of the American Original 60s guitars, this one included, are usually around that 8.5 pound range. Going over the rest of the specs, the American Original 60s Jaguars came with alder bodies. This one finished in this surf green. It was also available in sunburst, candy apple red, and Daphne blue. It's got a nitro finish, tinted maple neck with a laminated rosewood fretboard. We've got pearloid dot inlays and binding on that fretboard. Now, moving on to a couple more details, you will notice that just like the American Vintage series that came before it, it does have the decal sitting over that lacquer finish. And on the back, those single line pure vintage tuners made by Goto are, in my opinion, the best that you can get as far as vintage tuner goes. These are basically rebranded SD91s, which are always my go-to tuner of choice when it comes to my restorations and custom builds. Under the hood, we have got your typical AVRI Electronics CTS pots in the lead, 3 Switchcraft switches with the independent pickup selection switches as well as the strangle switch. And then we've got our rhythm circuit with our volume and tone roller knobs up here. Now, hardware-wise, these came with the American Vintage tremolo, same as the one that came on the, the AV65 and AV62 before it. I think some of these started to come with the flat lock design as compared to the rounded chamfer on the AV65s and the ones before them. And they came with the original threaded saddle barrel bridges, which, as we've mentioned before and always have to mention, some folks absolutely hate. Now, if you're playing 11 gauge strings and higher, I think you are going to get by just fine with that original threaded saddle bridge, so long as the guitar is set up correctly. You've got the correct radius set for those saddles. Everything should play just fine. Now, this one here had been upgraded by the previous owner to the American Pro bridge, which I think is an improvement if you're looking for a bit more sustain, for a bit more stability in case you like to play heavy-handed. It's not as solid and sturdy as something like a Mastery bridge because the slots in the bridge are not as deep. But that said, you do also have the option of locking this bridge into place using those the nylon inserts that Fender produces that come stock with the American Pro Jaguars to keep that bridge from rocking if you don't like the instability to your intonation that might introduce, especially if you are an active live performer. Also with the 52 millimeter string spacing to keep your outer ease away from the edge of the fretboard. These do not need neck shims, by the way. This one I found had a 1 degree neck shim when I first got it. It made the bridge sit unbelievably high, something like 9 or 10 millimeters high, which was way too much break angle and behind the bridge, and way too much string tension. And it wasn't a good setup when I first got this thing, but now I've got it dialed in with the Gabriel Tenorio Nickel Puro Trem Twist strings, which are specifically designed for the Jaguar. They are an 11 to 50 gauge string, and this thing feels phenomenal. Now, as I've been saying, the changes between this and the AV65 are minimal, right down to the, medium to thicker C neck profile, the fact that it has a 9.5 inch radius and vintage tall frets makes really a minimal difference, at least to me, and that's coming from someone whose favorite radius is 7.25 with vintage frets. This feels, I'd say, 90% identical to that of an AV65 Jaguar. So moving on to the pickups, the pure vintage 62s or the American vintage 62 pickups that come stock in these are good Jaguar pickups to me. They've got that quintessential Jaguar tone. Yeah, they might be a little less bright with their Alnico 2 magnets when compared to the pure vintage 65s that came in the AV65, as well as are available as aftermarket pickups, but I really like them. I think they pair well with Fender tube amps like the Princeton Reverb, as well as the Deluxe Reverb. And yeah, I don't see a reason to have to upgrade them unless you are hunting for something more specific, such as hotter pickups, or you want them to be a bit brighter. Then yeah, you can swap them out. But I like the American Vintage 62 pickups just fine. Now, unfortunately, this is the last Jaguar that Fender has put out that has these mostly vintage accurate specs. The only premium nitro finish Jaguar that's currently still in Fender's lineup is the Johnny Marr Jaguar, which, as you know, has more modernized specs with regards to the switching configuration. And not all folks love that. So I am hoping that now that it's 2025 and with Winter NAMM right around the corner, that Fender hopefully introduces maybe an AV2 Jaguar with blocks and binding to the mix, because I think it has been a glaring omission on their part to keep this iconic offset off of their American Vintage 2 line. Is just a very, very strange and disappointing decision on their part. Now, let's just talk about quality control, because I think by now a lot of folks have discussed probably ad nauseum the fact that Fender's quality control, especially post-pandemic, had taken a dive. Now, this one was produced in the final run of the American original 60s. So any quality control issues that may have been reported were not present on this guitar. I think that this guitar, especially for not having seen a luthier in between the previous owner and myself, played great. It required, just an adjustment of the truss rod. I took that 1 degree shim out of the already angled neck pocket. I did have to open up the slots in the bone nut a little bit to accommodate the 11 to 50 gauge strings, which was Strange to me, the strings were binding a little bit on the D and G slots. So that is definitely something to look out for. If your strings are binding at the nut, that is going to lead to tuning instability and it's going to drive you crazy. So if that's happening to you because you've picked up one of these recently, that is definitely one of the first places you're going to want to check. Again, with a good setup, nothing on the guitar needs to immediately be upgraded. Everything is pretty darn great as it is. These things are going, depending on the color and the condition that you find them in, they are going for about $1,800 to $2,500 plus on the used market. Definitely a bit cheaper than the AV65s, because those ones now have become kind of unicorns in the used market. Everyone that's bought one has held on to those. Whereas these start to pop up every now and again. You'll find them on Reverb or eBay or Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist even. Again, it's a lot more common to find guitars from this series than the AV65s. Well, I think that about does it for this guitar. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit that like and subscribe button, as well as the notification bell if you haven't already. It helps this small channel to grow. And as always, don't forget to follow Totally Wired Guitars for more offset guitars buying tips.